To a generation of classic movie fans, Conrad Veidt is defined by his role as Major Heinrich Strasser in Michael Curtiz's Casablanca. Curtiz packed the film with European actors, and the power of this scene, in which the Marseillaise drowns out the Germans, brought many of them to genuine tears. Veidt died the following year, and it is ironic that this is the most famous role of such a prominent anti-Nazi, a man who donated a large chunk of his own life savings to the British war effort and, in 1940, arranged Christmas gifts for the children of London sheltering from the Blitz. But perhaps his greatest cinematic legacy is as a horror star. It was in genre films that Veidt made his name, the intensity of his performances matching that of the films themselves, dark fantasies of twisted fates and doomed men. A review of a play in which Veidt appeared at the Deutsches Theatre in 1917 hoped that God would keep this talented young actor out of the cinema. God apparently wasn't listening, and Veidt made his film debut that same year. His earliest surviving horror, and his earliest surviving film, is a prescient one in every sense. In Fear, Veidt plays an Indian mystic who foresees a grim future for Count Grevin after his theft of a sacred Indian idol. It's not a great film, and it's not a large role, but Veidt mesmerises in it, already showcasing that ability to hold the camera that would make him a star. Fear was directed by Robert Wiener, who will appear elsewhere on this list. I said that Fear was Veidt's earliest surviving role because he had already made 2 films, both of which are now lost, as are many of his silent films, including some infuriatingly tempting ones for horror fans. Veidt seems to have been a genre star right from the off, his debut, The Path of Death, sounding like an old dark house mystery. He played the devil in F.W. Murnau's Saturnus, and again in comedy Kurfürstendamm, in which the devil comes to Earth to find out why so many people are coming to hell from that particular street, and ends up getting mugged on it. There was also Count Cagliostro, a story Universal later considered for Boris Karloff. Of the 21 films Veidt made with director Richard Oswald, all those that might reasonably be considered horror are lost, including Night Figures, playing the devil again in a film of, according to reviewers, nightmare-like occurrences and fantastic beings. We've got to mention Wahnsinn, or Madness, one of 2 films directed by Veidt himself, both now lost, another story of death, fate and madness. And while not horror, it's worth mentioning Land Without Women, the first German sound film, also lost. But if we had to pick one, something we seldom do in our top 10s, it would have to be Januskopf, or Janus Head, an adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by F.W. Murnau. The idea of Veidt playing those characters, directed by the maker of Nosferatu, is mouth-watering. Veidt's last silent film was also the last film he made during his initial stay in the US. The last performance reunites Veidt with Mary Philbin, with whom he had starred in The Last Laugh, of which more later. But while imaginatively shot by Paul Feho, this is nowhere near as good. It feels as if Universal, having successfully subbed Veidt in once for Lon Chaney, thought it was worth trying to ape the sort of gothic melodramas Chaney made with Todd Browning. But this has none of Browning's violent excess that stops those films from becoming turgid. Through no fault of Veidt's, Eric the Great can't compare with Alonzo the Armless. He's just a thwarted lover. Although his diabolical plan is better conceived than anything Browning ever came up with. Incidentally, hypnosis is really a feature of Veidt's career. As well as horror films, Veidt appeared in one science fiction, FP1 Doesn't Answer.
A floating aerodrome is to be built, an island of steel and glass.
Although the sci-fi aspect is pretty light and even less noticeable to modern audiences. But it's a lesser-known film that we wanted to include. Based on a novel by genre great Curtiz, this is essentially a German film, but made in 3 different language versions, with Veidt, somewhat confusingly, starring in the English language one.
Would you like to dance?
A story of romance, disaster, and industrial espionage. It's a solid film, but by far the best thing is Veidt's Major Ellison, a charismatic daredevil.
Don't stop right round the world. Nobody's done that yet.
Who suffers a fall from grace. Veidt's performance captures the shell of a broken man, but with enough of his old ego to put up a convincing front.
Call me when we start to sink.
He would essay a similar role in a later British film. After leaving Germany to escape Nazi rule, Veidt moved to England, managing to remain a prominent star. With the possibility of war in the air, he was repeatedly cast as German soldiers and agents, notably in The Spy in Black. Set in the First World War, the film is still remarkable in its sympathetic portrayal of a German U-boat commander, given it was released only weeks before Britain joined the Second World War. The first film in the writer-director pairing of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, it's a film of subtle motivations and sparkling dialogue.
Then you must be a prisoner of war.
No. You are.
Oh dear.
Giving Veidt the chance to play a more interesting variation on the role. Great film, can't recommend it highly enough. Not horror, at least not in the traditional sense, but aren't all war films horror films, in a way? Kind of. Given his feelings on Nazism and the fact that his wife was Jewish, it's probably not a coincidence that Veidt's first 2 films when he moved to England were The Wandering Jew and Jew Sus, not to be confused with the deeply anti-Semitic 1940 film nominally based on the same source material. His appearance in these films led to Veidt being detained when he returned to Germany to make The Legend of William Tell, eventually being released only after intervention from the British Foreign Office. That would be his last German film, and Veidt would eventually become a naturalised British citizen. His career in England, alongside war films of one kind or another, includes a pair of very different but memorable fantasies. The Passing of the Third Floor Back was co-written by Alma Reville, better known as Mrs. Alfred Hitchcock, and feels like a blend of The Lodger and The Bishop's Wife. It's a charming little film, and it's wonderful to see Veidt, so often the personification of evil, cast completely against type.
How peaceful.
But this slot has to go to The Thief of Baghdad, which stands alongside Casablanca as the pick of Veidt's late films.
Are you a magician? I have some skill.
One of the most ambitious and agelessly wonderful British films of its time and of all time, Veidt slips comfortably into the role of evil sorcerer, even committing one of the unforgivable sins of cinema.
Throw him overboard.
And once again, seriously, it's amazing how many of his films feature hypnosis. Speaking of hypnosis, this top 10 has so far tiptoed around horror because we want to give an overview of Veidt's career, and because so many of his horror films are lost, you could do a top 10 just of those. It is to silent films to which we must come to confirm Veidt's status as a horror star, starting with the biggest name of them all. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is one of those films that people have heard of and whose images they know, even if they have never seen the film itself. I know people don't like the word iconic, but what else can you call it? Why is this number 5 rather than number 1? Well, partly because we have already done a half-hour video about it, so please watch that. But also because this is, like all top 10s, down to personal preference. Mine. And while this is Veidt's most important film, his most revolutionary film, I honestly think he made better ones, or at least ones I personally prefer. Which takes nothing away from an astonishing performance. He's not actually in the film that much, but when he is, you cannot take your eyes off of him. And it's this performance which best showcases that intensity which defines Conrad Veidt. It's also a performance that defines the expressionist aesthetic that makes Caligari such a unique film. Veidt is as stylized as his surroundings, but still wins our compassion. Now I'm starting to think I should have put it higher. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was directed by Robert Wiener, with whom Veidt had worked before and with whom he would work again on 1924's The Hands of Orlac. Following a train wreck, one of the best sequences in the film, pianist Paul Orlac becomes obsessed with the idea that his injured hands have been replaced by those of a murderer. The first of several versions, official and not, of Maurice Renard's novel, this is a more psychological take on the story, suggesting it may all be delusion caused by post-traumatic stress. But when a real murder occurs, then everything changes. Perhaps more than any other role, Orlac showcases Veidt's physical acting. Treating his hands like alien appendages, led by them, scared of them. They do things he would not. Or is it all in his head, the enactment of subconscious desires? The film is a bit slow and a bit too long, but it's such a great performance. The horror playing out through the psychology of Paul Orlac, and Veidt playing it to the hilt. The Haroun al-Rashid episode of Paul Laney's fantasy horror Waxworks inspired Douglas Fairbanks to make 1924's The Thief of Baghdad, which in turn inspired Alexander Korda to make the British version we mentioned a few entries back. This is an anthology film comprised of 3 episodes inspired by Waxworks in a fairground tent, with Veidt playing Ivan the Terrible. The most horrifying episode, although Spring-Heeled Jack is perhaps the more disturbing, Veidt's Ivan is a monster, but a deeply insecure one. His suspicions of all around him eventually leading to his downfall into madness. It's a great portrayal. Evil, lecherous, trickling over into mania. Veidt conveying the otherworldliness of the all-powerful dictator who can get away with anything, while never losing that sense of the pathetic. It's also a tremendously entertaining film by a director who excelled at the balance between dark and light and art versus crowd-pleasing. Directed by Nosferatu screenwriter Henrik Galeen, 1926's The Student of Prague is a remake of the 1913 Paul Wegener film, which has a claim to being the first feature-length horror film of all time. It's also one of the most undeservedly neglected films of its era. Find the 2-hour restoration if you can, featuring Stephen Horn's excellent score, and if you can find it easily available with English titles, then please let me know where. Veidt plays fencing champion Baldwin, who, despite his skill with the blade, is too poor to win the Countess of his dreams, and so makes a deal with the Mephistophelian Scapinelli, played by Dr. Caligari himself, Werner Krauss. Scapinelli offers wealth in return for anything he wants from Baldwin's room, choosing Baldwin's reflection. It's a spin on Faust, but a very fine one. Lively, creepy, atmospheric, and technically superb. Building to a magnificent climax as Baldwin faces down his own reflection. Desperately fleeing, but unable to escape. In its fatalist themes, this is a typical German film of the period, albeit a more naturalistic one than fans of Expressionist cinema might be expecting. It's also a great showcase of Conrad Veidt's range as an actor, as the morose student goes off the rails before losing it all. I really love this film. Ask me on another day and this could be number one. In another world, this number one slot would be reserved for Conrad Veidt's Dracula, directed by Paul Laney. But Laney's unexpected death robbed us of that, and Veidt returned to Germany. The film they did make together is another one about which we have made a longer video, and pretty controversially, given the title of this top 10, it's not really horror. The Man Who Laughs is a period drama, more comparable in Veidt's CV to films like Lucretia Borgia, The Chess Player, or the brilliantly titled Rasputin, Demon of Women, which gives Veidt his best, certainly his longest, death scene. Period films, although Rasputin was only set 15 years earlier, but with horror overtones. In a top 10 of horror films, it may be ridiculous to have The Man Who Laughs at number one, but it's fabulous. It's a great film, and while it may not be horror per se, it has strong elements of horror. And its influence on the genre was immense. As we detail in our longer video, and yet as every second comment on that video feels the need to point out, it inspired the Joker. But this is all about Veidt's performance. His face held in a rictus grin by Jack Pierce's punishing makeup, Veidt's features still communicate a range of emotions, capturing the moments of joy and heartbreak in a man trapped behind a mask that he cannot remove, that defines him in the eyes of others and so to himself. When he breaks free from his own insecurities, the catharsis is palpable. The film more than earning its big action climax. It takes the grotesqueries of horror and turns them on their head by making them human. Which, as much as anything, was Veidt's gift. Whether as a victim like Cesare or a monster like Ivan, he made horror human. In the silent era, Veidt's career ran the gamut from playing Phineas Fogg in Around the World in 80 Days to Different from Others, possibly the first film to deal explicitly with a gay relationship. By the time of Casablanca, he told co-star Paul Henreid, "There's a time when we win and a time when we lose. Well, I won very early in my career and now I'm losing. But I had it all. And now I do it for the money and for my wife. And we have a good life." I hope he did have a good life, because that's a sad summation. At the start of his career, he made The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. 20 years later, he made Casablanca. That's extraordinary. Two totally different films, but both of them immovable monuments in film history. Popular at the time, still popular now. Yes, we wish he'd lived longer and done more, but the brilliance of the work Veidt left has given him a status accorded to few actors. He is still respected, revered, and loved. Thanks for watching, and special thanks to our Patreons whose support makes these longer videos possible. What are your favourite Conrad Veidt films, and which of his many lost films would you most like to see? Let us know in the comments below.